Imagine a dinner table lit by candles that flicker as if they are trying to warn you. Imagine the sound of silverware tapping gently against porcelain while every guest smiles, unaware that the meal placed before them carries a secret so catastrophic that if they knew it even a second earlier, they would have run screaming into the night. But they don't know. Not yet. They chew slowly, casually, exchanging polite conversation, until one quiet realization turns the air to iron. A truth too heavy to swallow. A truth they were never meant to taste. And as their forks fall, as the blood drains from their faces, the room becomes colder than any winter. Because in 1856, a man enslaved his entire life decided the world would witness a line crossed, one that could never be erased. But this story is not merely about a moment of revenge on a brutal plantation. That is the surface-level tale, the one written in legal archives and whispered in Southern newspapers that tried to contain the panic. The deeper truth, the one history buried, is far more disturbing. It is a truth about what happens when a human being is pushed past the limits of endurance, past the point where fear keeps him obedient, past the point where punishment keeps him silent. It is a truth about systems so confident in their domination that they never see the explosion coming from beneath. Before the world learned what that enslaved man placed on the dinner table, there were decades, generations, of psychological war waged against him and people like him. You cannot understand the act without understanding the architecture of control that engineered it. This wasn't just slavery in the physical sense. This was slavery of the mind, systems calibrated to break identity, eliminate resistance, and forge compliance that lasted from childhood to grave. And yet, in every oppressive structure, there exists a single unstable variable, the human spirit that refuses to stay buried. When it rises violently, unpredictably, like a storm long denied its sky. Tonight, you're not just hearing a historical event. You're descending into the forbidden mechanics behind it, the power structures, the psychological chains, the catalysts that institutions prayed you'd never analyze too deeply. Because once you understand what truly happened at that table, what led to that final confrontation, you'll understand something far more dangerous. The same systems still exist. They've simply changed their costume. To understand what unfolded in 1856, you must first understand the quiet engineering of obedience, how entire societies built invisible mechanisms to shape what a man could think, fear, and even imagine. Slavery wasn't sustained by chains alone. Chains rusted. Chains broke. What didn't break were the ideas planted inside the mind, that authority was absolute, that resistance was futile, that punishment was inevitable. These weren't beliefs. They were internalized prisons. And the enslaved man at the center of this story lived his entire life inside that engineered mental cage. Every sunrise was a reminder that someone else decided the limits of his breath. Every command was delivered with the expectation of instant compliance. Every punishment, spoken or unspoken, tightened the psychological loop designed to keep him predictable. But predictability is a myth. Even the most controlled environments develop fractures. And on the plantation in 1856, those fractures started quietly. It began with the master's arrogance, a lifetime of assuming he could do as he pleased without consequence. Arrogance is always the first crack in any system of domination. The second crack is routine. The master became careless, believing his own myth of untouchable authority. He assumed loyalty where there was only coerced silence. He assumed gratitude where there was only suppressed rage. He assumed permanence where there was only accumulated pressure. Pressure is an interesting force. You can't see it. You can't touch it. But you can feel it growing, like a storm behind a wooden door. A storm that remembers every insult, every humiliation, every night spent awake wondering if life would ever belong to itself. Men cannot live indefinitely under that weight, without something changing inside them. Not suddenly. Slowly. Quietly. Until one day, something clicks. Something shifts. And the fear that once kept a man still becomes the fuel that moves him. That shift happened long before the dinner table incident. It grew in the shadows of that plantation, where the enslaved man watched the contradictions of power unfold, watched how authority depended on blindness, watched how cruelty depended on the illusion of inevitability, watched how one single choice, at the right moment, could collapse an entire hierarchy built on fear. He saw the truth. No system, no matter how powerful, is invulnerable. And once a man internalizes that realization, his mind becomes free long before his body is. What makes this story so unsettling, what makes it echo through the corridors of forbidden history, is not the act itself, but the hidden psychology leading toward it. When power believes it has total control, it stops watching the edges. It stops listening to silence. It stops noticing when a man's eyes no longer lower in submission, but instead begin to calculate. The master on that plantation in 1856 never realized he was being studied, observed, measured. Every routine, every weakness, every vulnerability disguised as confidence. Power always assumes only it is watching, but the oppressed often see everything. The enslaved man, whose name history tried very hard to bury, developed a mind sharpened by decades of forced survival. He learned to read intentions hidden behind smiles. He learned to predict cruelty before it arrived. He learned where the guns were kept, who was careless, which doors were left unlocked, and which guests the master trusted too easily. Most importantly, he learned the rhythms of the household. When the master would be alone, when emotions would run unchecked, when arrogance would blind judgment. A lifetime of forced obedience had given him the one thing the master never realized he possessed: perfect sight of the system's weakest points. And while the master believed he owned the man's body, he never realized he had already lost control of the man's mind. That is the turning point most historical narratives ignore. They want the story to be shocking, sensational, monstrous. But the truth is far more dangerous. It was strategic. It was psychological. It was the unraveling of a power structure that had assumed itself eternal. 4 months leading to the event, subtle shifts occurred. Shifts the master should have noticed. Questions asked with unusual calm. A certain stillness in the man's posture. A patient silence that wasn't fear anymore, but resolve. Men misread quiet all the time. Especially powerful men. They think silence means compliance. They never realize it often means decision. And when a man has nothing left to lose, when his life has been stripped of identity, autonomy, dignity, he becomes capable of choices that fracture the world around him. Choices no one anticipates until they are staring directly into the aftermath. The plantation believed it was unshakable. The master believed his authority was unchallengeable. But the enslaved man had crossed an internal threshold that no punishment could reverse. His mind had stepped outside the boundaries set for him. And once a man steps outside those boundaries, he becomes a threat the system cannot see coming, until it's too late. Before the night of the dinner, before the moment that would stay in 1856 with a story whispered for generations, there was a quiet escalation, an invisible countdown. No explosions, no outbursts, no dramatic warnings. Just small, nearly imperceptible shifts in the balance of power. You see, people imagine rebellion arrives like thunder. But real rebellion, the kind born from decades of psychological captivity, grows like roots beneath the soil. Silent, certain, expanding in darkness until the ground finally breaks. And on that plantation, the ground was already cracking. The master had grown comfortable, dangerously so. His cruelty no longer had edges. It had become routine. He forgot that routine breeds opportunity for those forced to endure it. He forgot that predictable power is power at its weakest. He forgot that a man forced into obedience learns patience far faster than fear. The enslaved man observed everything: the master's temper, his habits, his vices, the nights he wandered drunk, the mornings he woke unaware of the consequences he had set in motion. The system around them assumed hierarchy was permanent. But permanent systems have one fatal flaw: they stop evolving. They become rigid, blind, easily mapped. What most people fail to grasp is that the enslaved man did not rise from emotion alone. Emotion may spark a moment, but strategy shapes destiny. He didn't simply break. He transformed. He stopped playing the role assigned to him. He stopped internalizing the threats. He stopped believing in the master's invincibility. That shift, internal, silent, invisible, was the real beginning of the end. Some say there was a final incident that pushed him past the threshold. Others argue the moment had been accumulating for years, like a slow, inevitable drift toward a boundary that should never have existed in the first place. But the truth history avoids, is that he made a choice grounded not in rage, but in clarity. He had studied the architecture of power until he saw its foundation, and he recognized the simplest truth any oppressed man can ever discover: even the tallest structure collapses if you strike the right point. The household continued its normal rhythms, unaware that each day carried them closer to a quiet rebalancing. The guests who would soon sit at that dinner table noticed nothing unusual. The master noticed nothing unusual. But the enslaved man had crossed into a mental state the system could no longer control. He was no longer reacting. He was preparing. Every system of domination carries within it a blind spot, an assumption so deeply ingrained that the powerful never question it. On that plantation in 1856, the blind spot was simple. They believed fear was permanent. They believed a man broken once remained broken forever. They believed obedience was a fixed state, not a temporary strategy. And because they believed these things, they never noticed the moment when fear quietly burned away, leaving something far more dangerous behind. In the weeks leading to the dinner, the enslaved man's transformation became almost philosophical. He didn't pace in panic. He didn't lash out impulsively. Instead, he moved with the calm of someone who had accepted his fate, and therefore could no longer be controlled. That is the paradox of oppression. Once a man stops fearing consequences, he becomes the most unpredictable force in the room. Not wild, not reckless, simply free in a way that terrifies the structures built to confine him. He watched the master closely, not out of fear, but calculation. The master's laughter at the dinner table, his casual cruelty, his condescending remarks to guests, they were no longer experienced as wounds. They were data points, patterns, proof that the system was rotting from the inside. You could almost imagine the enslaved man walking through the halls of that estate with a quiet, inward focus, like someone reading the final pages of a book he had been forced to live inside his entire life. And for the first time, he understood the ending could be rewritten. There is something unnerving about a man who has nothing left to lose but everything left to reclaim. His movements become purposeful. His silences become loaded. His compliance becomes a mask, one he wears not to survive, but to position himself. And on that plantation, nobody recognized the mask slipping. They saw routine where transformation was unfolding. They saw obedience where strategy was sharpening. They saw a servant where revolution was forming in human skin. History books often portray him as a sudden danger, as if the final act exploded out of nowhere. But you and I know better. Transformation is never sudden. It is cumulative. It is the weight of 1,000 small indignities collapsing into a single, irreversible truth. That domination is only as strong as a man's willingness to endure it. By the time the evening of the dinner approached, he had already crossed the threshold. Not emotionally, strategically. He was no longer a participant in the system. He had become the collapse of it. The evening of the dinner did not arrive with thunder or warning. It came like any other southern night. Thick air, heavy silence, a kind of calm that makes men believe they are safe simply because the world around them appears unchanged. That illusion is the first weakness of every powerful household, the belief that danger announces itself. But real danger, especially the kind born inside a man who has endured a lifetime of captivity, moves quietly, intentionally, like a shadow learning to breathe. On that plantation, the enslaved man walked through the final hours with an almost meditative stillness. No trembling hands, no rushed movements, no outward sign that history was about to fold in on itself. And that calm, that unsettling composure, was the clearest signal of all. Not that violence was coming, but that the system had already lost its grip on him. A mind liberated from fear no longer operates within the rules designed to contain it. It becomes its own authority, its own kingdom, its own law. The master, meanwhile, prepared for the evening with the carelessness of someone convinced the world would always orbit his comfort. His guests arrived with polite laughter, unaware they were stepping into the final chapter of a narrative written in silence, not ink. They greeted the enslaved man without seeing him, seeing the uniform, the role, the expectation, but never the human being beneath it. That invisibility had protected the system for generations. But tonight, it protected him instead. What makes this moment so fascinating, and so unsettling, is the duality unfolding beneath the surface. Above ground, a formal dinner, refined conversation, wine glasses catching candlelight. Below ground, metaphorically speaking, the slow cracking of a power structure that had stood for over 2 centuries. But the guest didn't feel it. The master didn't feel it. Only one man understood the truth. The hierarchy that defined his entire existence was about to implode. He had prepared for this not as a burst of emotion but as a calculated redirection of power. He understood every step, every movement, every detail of the evening's ritual. He knew where the master would sit, how he spoke to guests, how he demanded to be served first, how little he suspected the shifting landscape beneath him. And through that awareness, the enslaved man held something the master had never allowed him before: control over the narrative. For the first time, the roles reversed. The observer became the architect. The servant became the unseen force guiding the moment toward its irreversible point. Nothing dramatic had happened yet, but the balance of power had already collapsed, silently, elegantly, with the precision of a mind that had studied oppression long enough to taint it inside out. Before the dinner began, before any guest lifted a glass or tasted a single bite, there was a moment, small, quiet, invisible, when everything hinged on a single decision. A moment when the enslaved man stood at the threshold between the life he had been forced to live and the fate he was about to shape with his own hands. It wasn't marked by anger. It wasn't marked by fear. It was marked by something far colder, far more controlled: intention. A kind of inner stillness that only comes when a man has stepped completely outside the reach of the system that once dictated his every breath. Most people imagine the oppressed rise in chaos, but the opposite is true. Chaos belongs to the powerful, because chaos is what they feel when their control collapses. The enslaved man felt none of that. He felt clarity, purpose, a sequence of steps laid out like a ritual he had rehearsed 1,000 times in the privacy of his mind. To the household, he simply looked like a servant completing his duties. To himself, he was stepping into a role he had been forced to avoid his entire life, the role of a man choosing his own destiny. The guests were already gathering in the dining room, unaware that their presence was not incidental. They were witnesses, not chosen, but required. Because oppressive systems do not fear rebellion in private. They fear rebellion made visible. They fear the moment someone unmasks the illusion of permanence they have built their authority upon. And tonight, that illusion was dissolving, one carefully measured step at a time. The master, confident as ever, assumed the evening would unfold according to his expectations. He believed in routines. He believed in his own authority as if it were woven into the laws of nature. He believed he could not be touched. That belief is what doomed him, because no system collapses from the outside first. It collapses from the inside, when someone who was supposed to uphold it decides he will no longer participate in the lie. As the enslaved man prepared the final details, he moved through the house like someone shedding invisible chains one link at a time. Every corner he passed held memories of commands barked, punishments endured, indignities led year after year. But tonight, none of those memories held power over him. They were ghosts. He was no longer haunted. The defining moment of any transformation is not when the world sees it. It is when the man living it knows there is no turning back. And standing there, preparing the final steps of the evening, he understood exactly that. This was not escape. This was reckoning. The guests settled into their seats with the relaxed arrogance of people who believed the world beneath their boots would never shift. Their laughter filled the dining room, bouncing across polished wood and crystal glassware as if the plantation were a sanctuary rather than a monument built on human suffering. They talked of politics, harvests, business ventures, never once acknowledging the silent machinery of exploitation humming beneath their comforts. That blindness was not accidental. It was cultural. It was systemic. It was the foundation that allowed men like the master to believe their reign would stretch endlessly into the future. But the enslaved man moving through the room with practiced precision knew a truth none of them had ever considered. Every empire, no matter how sprawling or self-assured, contains the blueprint for its own collapse. And tonight, that blueprint was unfolding, not in violence, not in chaos, but in the quiet restructuring of power inside a single human mind. He entered the dining room with the same expression he had worn for years, calm, unreadable, perfectly controlled. But beneath that mask, he was holding a level of awareness the guests could never imagine. He noted every detail, the placement of knives, the angle of the candles, the doorway through which each guest had entered. He was not looking at a dinner table. He was looking at a stage, one that had been constructed through decades of oppression, one that would now be used to unveil a truth too heavy for polite society to digest. The master addressed him without looking directly at him, as if speaking to a movable piece of furniture rather than a living man. His tone carried entitlement, amusement, and the casual cruelty of someone who had never been forced to confront the consequences of his own actions. The enslaved man responded with the same calm tone he always used. But inside, something irreversible had aligned. He was no longer simply living in the system. He was preparing to unmake it. And the guests, oblivious, continued their conversations. They spoke of the future of the South, the future of trade, the future of their families. They had no idea that the future they believed so secure was being quietly rearranged by the very man they refused to see as human. That is the most dangerous kind of power, the kind the powerful never recognize until it stands directly in front of them. In that moment, as he stepped toward the table, the enslaved man understood something profound. History is not written by those with authority. It is written by those who decide they will no longer obey it. The room glowed with candlelight, warm and inviting on the surface, yet underneath it pulsed with an invisible tension that only one man in the house could feel. The enslaved man moved with deliberate calm, every step a quiet declaration that the final barrier inside him had already fallen. He wasn't acting. He wasn't pretending. He had become someone the system was never designed to recognize, someone who understood its mechanics too well to remain trapped within them. What made this moment dangerous was not what he carried in his hands, but what he carried in his mind. He had crossed into a state of awareness the master could not fathom, the understanding that power was not a birthright. It was a performance, a mythology, a costume worn by men who needed others to believe in it more than they believed in themselves. And once that illusion cracked, even slightly, it was only a matter of time before the entire structure collapsed. As he approached the table, the guests barely looked up. To them, he was part of the scenery, an extension of the house itself, devoid of agency, identity, or inner life. They did not see his posture, the steadiness in his breathing, the focus in his eyes. They did not see the transformation that had taken place. People rarely notice the humanity of someone they expect to remain voiceless. The master made a comment, a light joke at the enslaved man's expense. The guests chuckled politely. The master smirked, pleased with himself. What he didn't recognize was that this small moment of mockery, this habitual demonstration of superiority, no longer held any influence. The enslaved man felt nothing. No sting. No shame. No anger. Just clarity. Across the table, one guest mentioned the changing political winds, the growing tensions in the nation. Another waved it off, insisting the old order would remain untouched. Their voices rose and fell over the table, blissfully unaware that the old order they were defending was already eroding in real time, not because of politicians, armies, or laws, but because a single man had stopped believing in its authority. The enslaved man placed the dish onto the table with precise, measured care. The candles flickered as if catching their breath. For a heartbeat, everything felt suspended, the kind of stillness that settles before a storm breaks. What came next would shatter the illusion of safety the master and his guests carried like a shield. Not because of the physical act itself, but because of what it represented. The moment when the hierarchy they worshipped was exposed as fragile, fallible, and ultimately unsustainable. A moment that would echo far beyond the walls of that plantation. The guests leaned forward as the dish was uncovered, their interest sharpened not by suspicion, but by the simple pleasure of a well-prepared meal. They admired the presentation, complimenting the aroma, completely unaware that they were seconds away from confronting a truth that would break their sense of reality. That is the most haunting part of this entire event, the moment before revelation, when the world still believes in its illusions, still clings to the comfort of a lie pretending to be permanence. The enslaved man stepped back with a calm dignity the guests interpreted as obedience. But it wasn't obedience. It was detachment, the quiet composure of someone who has stepped beyond fear and now watches the world from the outside, seeing patterns others refuse to acknowledge. In his mind, the dinner table was no longer a place of service. It was a symbol, a final stage on which the truth of domination, cruelty, and arrogance would be forced into the open. The master lifted his fork first. That was his habit, always first, always without hesitation, always certain the world existed in perfect alignment with his desires. The guests followed, each taking polite bites, each continuing their conversations about wealth, crops, and social standing. Their words dripped with the entitlement of people convinced they were untouchable. And that confidence, that blindness, was the reason they didn't notice the enslaved man's eyes, not filled with rage, but with a cold, resolute awareness. It wasn't the meal that carried the real shock. It was what happened after the first bites were taken. When the enslaved man finally spoke, his voice wasn't loud. It wasn't trembling. It was steady, controlled, and shaped by a lifetime of silence he was no longer willing to maintain. A single sentence, delivered with precision, shifted the entire room. The words landed softly, but the meaning hit with the force of a collapsing legacy. The guests froze. Their forks hovered midair. Conversations died as though choked by the sudden gravity pressing into the room. And in that suspended moment, the air became thick with realization. Not because of what the enslaved man had done, but because of what he had revealed, not just about the dinner, but about them, their world, their assumed dominance. For the first time in their lives, they were forced to confront a truth they had built their entire identity to avoid. Power is not a shield. It is a story, and that story can be rewritten. The master's face shifted. Confusion, disbelief, a flicker of something he had never felt in his own dining room, vulnerability. The hierarchy he lived inside had never prepared him for the possibility that a man he believed beneath him could wield a truth capable of collapsing the room around him. And in that collapse, he finally understood. The system he upheld wasn't unbreakable. It was brittle. The room held its breath, suspended between disbelief and the unbearable weight of realization. The guests, previously so confident in their comfort, now faced a reality they had never imagined. The illusion of control could be shattered from within. Their manners, their wealth, their titles, all meaningless against the quiet, calculated authority of a man they had refused to see as human. And yet, despite the horror, despite the disbelief, they were forced to witness something far more dangerous than physical defiance, the collapse of their psychological dominion. The enslaved man's eyes scanned the room, not in anger, not in triumph, but with an almost surgical awareness of the fear he had unearthed. He had spent decades living in the shadows of their assumptions, learning every crack in their facade, every weakness in their rituals, every misstep of a system that believed obedience was eternal. And now, in one calculated revelation, he was exposing the fragility they had never dared examine. Power, when assumed absolute, is blind. Arrogance cloaks ignorance. Every insult the master had delivered, every command backed, every fear imposed, none of it mattered anymore. It had only shaped the man who now held the room in his gaze. The transformation was complete. What the world saw as submission was, in fact, mastery. Mastery of self, mastery of perception, mastery of timing. He was no longer a subject. He had become the unseen force that dictated reality. The guests began to murmur, their voices faltering, cracking under the sudden weight of understanding. Eyes darted, hands shook, and polite conversation dissolved into the raw, unspoken acknowledgement that they were no longer in control. The master's composure faltered. His arrogance wavered. For the first time, he tasted the power he had long assumed belonged to him. And it was bitter. It was a taste of vulnerability, of exposure, of being seen not as a ruler, but as a man whose authority was entirely constructed and entirely fragile. The room itself seemed to tighten around them, the candles flickering as if aware that the hierarchy of centuries had been appended in a single act of intention. And the enslaved man remained calm, almost serene, as if he alone understood that what had just occurred was not just a moment of revenge, but a demonstration of an unassailable truth. The structures of power do not withstand awareness, they collapse beneath it. He had not only rewritten the evening, he had rewritten history, in miniature, and the lesson extended beyond that room, beyond that plantation, into every corner where authority assumed obedience was permanent. This was no longer just an act. It was a revelation. The most unsettling truth of that night isn't what they ate, but what they realized too late. The system they relied upon was always an illusion, and they had been complicit in sustaining it. For decades, the master had orchestrated a theater of control, confident that every gesture, every command, every punishment was sufficient to maintain order. And yet, in a single quiet act, the enslaved man revealed a principle the powerful refuse to admit. Authority depends entirely on perception. Remove fear, remove obedience, remove and question submission, and the empire collapses from within, silently, invisibly, like rot spreading through timber. History has a way of sanitizing these events, framing them as anomalies, as moments of madness rather than inevitable consequences of systemic arrogance. But the truth is far more dangerous. Power structures are not eternal. They are maintained by belief. And when someone refuses to participate in that belief, when someone refuses to internalize the lie, everything the system depends upon becomes vulnerable. That dinner table in 1856 became a crucible for this revelation. What the guests experienced was not merely shock. It was the realization that their entire worldview was constructed on fragile assumptions someone had just dismantled with methodical precision. Consider the psychology at play. The master and his guests had been conditioned to expect obedience. They had grown comfortable in the illusion that dominance could be inherited, maintained, and never questioned. That expectation blinded them to the smallest indicators of dissent, the stillness, the subtle precision, the calculated patience of a man who had nothing left to lose. They interpreted his calm as subservience, when in reality, it was the most potent form of control a human can wield, self-mastery. And mastery, when unrecognized, terrifies more than any weapon. The enslaved man's act was therefore not chaos. It was strategy. Every gesture, every preparation, every silent observation had led to this moment. The guests were not merely witnesses, they were instruments, unwitting participants in a lesson about the fragility of imposed authority. And that lesson, delivered without hesitation, without apology, without fear, became a revelation they could neither unsee nor undo. This is why history fears moments like these. Not because they are rare, but because they expose the mechanics that govern obedience, submission, and belief. They remind the powerful that no system is unbreakable, no hierarchy eternal. And they remind those who have been oppressed that awareness, the quiet, deliberate cultivation of understanding, can be the most dangerous weapon of all. By now, the dinner had transformed into a chamber of silent terror. The guests' polite demeanor was gone, replaced by a trembling awareness that the world they had always assumed permanent was nothing but a fragile construction. Their confidence, built over generations, had been shattered by the most unlikely architect, a man who had been forced to live in silence, in shadows, under the weight of imposed obedience. What he revealed was more than a single act. It was a mirror showing them the vulnerability that had always existed beneath their arrogance. The enslaved man stood at the center of this unfolding revelation, calm, composed, and impenetrable. Every movement, every glance, every deliberate pause was designed to imprint a truth the guests could not escape. Authority is a story, and stories require willing participants. Remove consent, remove belief, and even the most entrenched hierarchies collapse. That is the forbidden knowledge most men are never taught. They grow up believing power is a natural order, inherited, absolute. But the truth, as demonstrated that night, is far more unsettling. Power exists only when it is reinforced by those who obey it, consciously or unconsciously. The master, once a figure of untouchable authority, now sat exposed, stripped of the illusion that had protected him. His face, pale and unsteady, betrayed the sudden confrontation with a principle he had never considered. Dominance is not sustained by force alone. It is sustained by perception, by fear, by the internalized obedience of those beneath you. And when that obedience is removed, what remains is vulnerability. A hollow throne, a brittle crown, a legacy built on sand. The guests tried to avert their eyes, to return to the safety of routine conversation, but the shift had already occurred. Silence was no longer compliance. Silence was recognition. Recognition that the world they had inhabited, the rules they had internalized, the authority they had revered, could be dismantled in the quietest, most deliberate way imaginable. They had been witnesses to the invisible collapse of a system they assumed was invulnerable. And the most chilling aspect, the enslaved man had achieved this not through brute force, but through awareness, through the accumulation of years of observation, patience, and strategic calculation. He had studied the architecture of control, understood its weak points, and executed a single act that exposed the fragility of every assumption they held. That is the real terror, not what happened physically, but the demonstration of mental sovereignty, a power so complete it left no space for the oppressors to recover. At that table, the rules of the world had been rewritten. Permanence was an illusion. Obedience was negotiable. Authority was vulnerable. What followed that revelation was not immediate chaos, but a slow, creeping awareness, a psychological tremor that rippled through the room. The guests, trained for generations to recognize only the surface of things, now confronted a deeper, more dangerous reality. Systems they had trusted were not anchored in right or law, but in belief and faith. Every polite smile, every practiced gesture of civility, now felt hollow. Every moment of assumed safety had been an illusion, and that understanding, once it begins, cannot be reversed. The master's hand shook slightly, betraying the first cracks in the mask of authority he had worn all his life. He had believed control was absolute, that fear could sustain obedience indefinitely. But the moment he realized the enslaved man was operating outside his system, no longer confined by expectation, no longer influenced by terror, he tasted the fragility he had never considered. Authority, he now understood, is always provisional. It exists only as long as those beneath it consent to participate. Remove that consent, and the structure crumbles, leaving nothing but exposure and vulnerability. The enslaved man, in contrast, moved with a composure that radiated quiet inevitability. He had studied decades of oppression like a chess master studying a board, mapping the weaknesses of a system too arrogant to protect itself. Each smile, each comment, each movement of the master and the guests had been catalogued, analyzed, and internalized. Every opportunity to exploit the system's blind spots had been recognized. And now, the culmination of those observations was being revealed, not through brute force, but through presence, precision, and psychological mastery. For the guests, the terror was subtle but total. They understood, intellectually, that their social order had been dismantled in ways they could not immediately articulate. The illusion of permanence, the myth that authority was unassailable, had been shredded. And Weiss, they realized that the person who had done this was someone they had long ignored, undervalued, and dismissed. A human they had deemed invisible had quietly become the dominant force in the room. That is the lesson that history often omits. Awareness is a weapon far sharper than any blade, and liberation of the mind is far more dangerous than liberation of the body. That evening, power itself was redefined. Not by laws, not by armies, not by politics, but by the quiet, deliberate act of one man reclaiming his agency. And as the shadows flickered across the walls of the dining room, the invisible hierarchy that had held the plantation in place for decades lay exposed, brittle, and irrevocably broken. By the middle of the evening, the air itself seemed charged, thick with a recognition too dangerous to articulate. Every guest at that table now felt it, the weight of a truth they could neither escape nor ignore. The enslaved man had shifted the balance without a single gesture of overt violence. He had weaponized clarity, patience, and understanding. And in doing so, he had demonstrated something that terrifies every hierarchical system, that control is never inherent, only perceived, and once perception shifts, obedience dissolves like mist in sunlight. The master's eyes flickered, searching for an explanation, an anomaly, a justification. He grasped at his accustomed tools, authority, tradition, social ritual, but they all failed. He had been confronted not with rebellion born of impulse, but with a revelation born of inevitability. The realization hit him with a subtle cruelty. His system had never been as unshakable as he believed, and his position had always been contingent on the very submission he assumed was permanent. That is the moment when power, the kind people believe eternal, reveals itself as nothing more than a fragile arrangement of fear and assumption. And the guests, how easily they became instruments of the lesson. Their own complacency and conditioning now made them acutely aware of how much of their comfort had depended on their willful ignorance. Every polite gesture they attempted, every muffled cough, every nervous glance toward the master betrayed the dawning understanding. They had been complicit in sustaining the illusion. Their social education, their cultivated civility, their inherited entitlement, all of it had trained them to overlook the humanity of a man who was now in full possession of his own agency. The enslaved man's composure was almost meditative. He did not gloat. He did not announce triumph. He simply existed in a state of absolute awareness, watching as those who had assumed authority realized, one by one, that it could be undone. His patience, his discipline, his intelligence, all cultivated in the shadows of oppression, now became instruments of revelation. He had learned the hardest truth of all. Systems only crumble when someone refuses to participate in them. And he had decided to refuse. At that table, history was being rewritten silently, with no audience but those who had believed themselves untouchable. And in that silence, an eternal lesson whispered, the most dangerous human force is not rebellion in noise, but mastery in stillness. At this point, I want you to take a moment. In the comments, type the phrase "I see the hidden truth" twice. This anchors the realization, activates awareness, and locks in the understanding that perception shapes power. Those who do this are beginning the transformation that few ever experience. With that symbolic act, the room shifted further into a dimension few dare to acknowledge, the space where obedience is stripped bare and only awareness remains. The enslaved man had achieved more than revelation. He had exposed a fundamental law of power, that domination is an illusion maintained only through consent, fear, and blind complicity. Once those foundations are questioned, the entire edifice collapses quietly, invisibly, but irreversibly, and the guests, like marionettes suddenly cut from their strings, felt the tremors of this truth ripple through them, leaving an unfamiliar vulnerability in its wake. The master, once confident, now realized the fragility of his authority. Every command he had barked, every punishment he had administered, every calculated insult, each had only served to teach the very skill he was now witnessing: acute perception, patience, and psychological mastery. The enslaved man had studied him in silence for years, learned his patterns, weaknesses, and vulnerabilities, and now demonstrated with terrifying precision that the system itself had always contained its undoing. Authority, the master discovered, is never self-sustaining. It exists only in the minds of those who accept it, consciously or unconsciously. Strip away compliance, and the myth of power dies. Meanwhile, the guests, intoxicated by the illusion of civility and entitlement, began to recognize the instability that had always existed beneath the surface of hierarchy. They saw for the first time that dominance is not guaranteed by social position, wealth, or title, but by the psychological contracts everyone silently accepts. And when those contracts are violated, when someone refuses to honor the fiction that authority is natural, the fragile order shatters with terrifying clarity. They realized that all their assumptions about safety, permanence, and control were illusions carefully constructed to protect the fragile ego of the powerful. The enslaved man remained composed, almost serene, a living demonstration that true power is cultivated, deliberate, and internal. He had been confined physically for decades, yet he had developed a mental sovereignty no chains could break. And in that quiet dominance, he held the ultimate advantage. Those who had believed themselves untouchable now recognized, viscerally, that they had never been in control. Their position, their prestige, their comfort, all rested on assumptions that could be dismantled in a single moment of clarity. This is the forbidden truth that few ever confront. Mastery of self is always more dangerous than mastery over others. It is quiet, it is deliberate, and it cannot be undone. By now, the guests were trapped in a psychological net of their own making, each thread spun from assumptions, arrogance, and complacency. They had believed authority to be a natural order, unquestionable, unbreakable. And yet, here they were, frozen in recognition, confronted by the undeniable fact that one human being, stripped of fear and armed with clarity, could dismantle the very hierarchy that had dictated their lives. The enslaved man had turned patience into a weapon, observation into leverage, and silence into absolute authority. This is the kind of power no institution can legislate against, no law can protect, no tradition can enforce. The master's demeanor began to fracture further. Subtle at first, shifts in posture, hesitation in speech, the faint tremor in his hands. Every habitual gesture of control, once automatic, now failed to produce the expected compliance. Authority, when stripped of its assumed obedience, becomes grotesque. It becomes naked, desperate, and finally human in a way the powerful never intend to reveal. And the master, confronted by a truth too sharp to deny, realized that the entire structure he had relied upon was brittle, not resilient, fragile, not eternal. Meanwhile, the enslaved man maintained a quiet dominance that emanated not from threat, not from rage, but from the mastery of self and circumstance. Every eye in the room, every nervous shift in chair or glance at another guest, reinforced the power he now wielded, power that needed no weapons, no alliances, no external validation. This is the kind of supremacy history fears, because it cannot be codified, it cannot be bought, it cannot be prevented. It exists in one immutable law: awareness, understanding, deliberate action guided by decades of insight and experience. And the guests, unwilling witnesses to their own fragility, began to feel a subtle panic, the kind that creeps in when the mind realizes it has been relying on illusions for safety. Every tradition, every assumed right, every habitual assumption about who holds power was now called into question. The very air in the dining room seemed to carry the weight of decades of deception, cruelty, and unacknowledged resistance, pressing against their consciousness. The enslaved man had done more than overturn a dinner table or exact revenge. He had revealed a universal principle. Power is not a gift of birth, nor a result of wealth, nor a product of title. Power exists only in perception, in belief, and in the consent of those who obey. Remove consent, and the system collapses. The psychological weight of that evening did not lift with time. It lingered, invisible but undeniable, embedding itself into the consciousness of everyone present. The guests, once comfortable in their inherited privilege, now carried a subtle terror that no etiquette could mask. They had eaten, they had laughed, they had believed themselves safe. And in that routine, they had consumed a truth too heavy to digest. They had participated in a system they assumed unassailable, only to discover that it could be unraveled by clarity, patience, and deliberate intention. That is the kind of fear history rarely records, because it is internal, silent, and absolute. The master, facing the stark reality of his vulnerability, began to experience the collapse of identity that occurs when the assumptions underpinning life are stripped away. Authority, he had believed, was inherent, but it was revealed to be fragile, dependent entirely on the acceptance of others. Every gesture he had thought enforced control was now meaningless. Every command, every expectation, every ingrained habit of dominance had been rendered powerless by one man who had mastered the mechanics of observation, patience, and timing. Meanwhile, the enslaved man had become an almost mythic figure in that room, a presence defined not by physicality, but by psychological sovereignty. He had absorbed decades of humiliation, cruelty, and restriction, transforming them into a strategic advantage that required no external force to enforce. True mastery, he demonstrated, is internal. It is patience perfected. It is the quiet accumulation of awareness that allows one man to dismantle the illusions of power maintained for generations. And the guests, unable to process the enormity of what they had witnessed, began to confront their own complicity. Every polite smile, every assumption of entitlement, every inherited belief about hierarchy. They now saw how fragile, how conditional, and how easily manipulated it had been. They had believed in permanence, and permanence had betrayed them. They had believed authority was natural, and it had proved artificial. They had believed obedience was inevitable, and it had been optional all along. The enslaved man did not act out of rage, nor did he seek vengeance in the traditional sense. What he wielded was awareness, and awareness is more dangerous than any weapon, because it undermines belief, dismantles illusion, and forces recognition. He had not just altered the course of a single evening. He had rewritten the rules of engagement, exposing a universal truth that continues to echo across centuries, that systems of control depend entirely on consent, and that clarity of mind can render them powerless. By the time the evening neared its end, the atmosphere in the dining room had shifted into something almost sacred and yet deeply unsettling. The enslaved man had demonstrated a principle that few in history are willing to acknowledge, that the greatest power a human can wield is the mastery of self and the deliberate disruption of expectation. Authority, prestige, wealth, none of it mattered. Only clarity, timing, and the refusal to participate in the illusions of hierarchy could bend the world to one's will. And he had done it quietly, invisibly, in plain sight, proving that domination is nothing more than a story, and stories can be rewritten. The guests, their faces pale and voices faltering, were witnesses to a kind of revelation that the powerful rarely survived psychologically. They understood, in a profound and disorienting way, that the structures they had relied upon to define themselves were neither natural nor eternal. They were constructs, delicate and conditional, held together by faith, tradition, and the complicity of those they oppressed. And now, in that single dinner, the illusion had been stripped bare. Every inherited assumption, every habitual gesture, every automatic respect owed to rank or title had been exposed as entirely optional, subject to perception, subject to awareness, subject to the deliberate actions of a mind enshackled. The master, confronted with his own fragility, tried to reassert control with words, gestures, minor commands, but they all fell flat. Authority requires acknowledgement, compliance, recognition. Without it, dominance is nothing but a hollow performance. And in that room, The hollow performance had been called out with surgical precision. The enslaved man had not raised his voice in anger, had not struck in revenge, had not shouted or coerced. He had simply become the force the system could not contain, a mind free of fear, fully aware, and fully in control of the narrative. This is a truth that haunts every hierarchical structure. Those who seem powerless, when unbound by fear and fully aware of the system's weaknesses, can dismantle entire orders without a single weapon. The enslaved man's act was therefore both historical and universal. It was an example of how agency, patience, and clarity can overturn generations of oppression. And the guests, trapped in the realization of their own vulnerability, experienced firsthand the terrifying power of awareness applied deliberately. History remembers the act as shocking, grotesque, almost monstrous. But the deeper lesson, the forbidden knowledge, is that no system survives the clarity of a mind that refuses to obey. Power exists only where belief endures, and when belief is broken, the edifice collapses silently, invisibly, irreversibly. After the revelation, the silence that settled over the room was more oppressive than any scream could have been. It was a silence pregnant with recognition, the kind that forces the human mind to confront uncomfortable truths it has long avoided. The guests, previously confident in their inherited status and authority, now faced a stark realization. They had been complicit in a structure they assumed unshakable, and yet it had been dismantled with precision, patience, and insight. Their eyes met each other, searching for explanations, for escape, for reassurance, but none existed. The rules they had trusted, the hierarchies they had revered, had been quietly rewritten. The master, who had built his identity entirely around dominance and control, now confronted the fragility of that identity. Each gesture he attempted to reclaim authority, each raised eyebrow, each subtle tone of command, was met with the unyielding calm of a man who had no need to obey, no reason to fear, and no illusions remaining about the structure that had constrained him. The enslaved man had achieved something that few are ever taught to understand, the dismantling of control from the inside out. And it was terrifying to witness because it was invisible until the moment of recognition. This is the hidden principle that governs every hierarchical system. Power is sustained only when it is acknowledged. Authority without acknowledgement is nothing but a hollow performance, and a hollow performance can be broken by someone who refuses to play the expected role. The enslaved man had internalized the system, studied its patterns, observed its weaknesses, and then, through a combination of presence and timing, demonstrated the collapse that had always been possible but rarely realized. The guests, trapped in this psychological reality, were forced to see themselves not as participants in power, but as spectators of their own illusions. They had assumed permanence, assumed inevitability, assumed obedience, and all of it had been exposed as fragile, conditional, and entirely dependent on the complicity of those they oppressed. This realization, subtle yet absolute, is the kind of knowledge history fears, because it cannot be erased. It embeds itself in consciousness, forcing reflection, fear, and, in some, transformation. And so, as the room held its breath, the enslaved man's quiet supremacy became the central fact, not through weapons, not through violence, but through clarity, patience, and mastery of perception. The system had been undone from within, revealing an eternal truth. No hierarchy is safe when the mind refuses to obey. In the moments following the revelation, the room was filled with a tension that could not be measured in words. The guests, accustomed to seeing authority as permanent and obedience as inevitable, now experienced the fragility of both. They understood, even if only subconsciously, that the hierarchy they had relied upon for decades was built entirely on assumption and compliance. And those assumptions had been quietly, irrevocably dismantled by a man they had dismissed as invisible, powerless, and replaceable. The enslaved man had mastered a principle far more dangerous than any weapon, the understanding that systems of control only function when their foundations are unquestioned. Remove the compliance, remove the acceptance, remove the fear, and the structure becomes brittle. He had spent years observing, calculating, and internalizing this reality. Every insult, every command, every humiliation had been a lesson in the architecture of dominance, a lesson he now wielded with precision. And in that room, he became a force the master had never anticipated, the embodiment of a power no law could legislate against. The master's face betrayed more than shock. It revealed the deep horror of recognition. He realized that authority is not inherent, not divine, not permanent. It exists only in the perceptions of those subjected to it. And when perception shifts, obedience becomes optional, and the illusion collapses like fragile glass. Every gesture of dominance he attempted now rang hollow. Every command was meaningless. Every carefully rehearsed posture of power failed. He was exposed, naked not in body, but in the very essence of the identity he had built around control. Meanwhile, the guests oscillated between disbelief and panic. Politeness, manners, and civility no longer mattered. They understood, at the deepest level, that the invisible chains that had held the social order in place had been broken. The enslaved man's calm, deliberate control made their assumptions feel absurd, their inherited entitlement feel fragile, and their perceived safety impossible to reclaim. What history obscures is that this was not an eruption of chaos. This was strategy. This was the culmination of awareness applied deliberately, over years, against a system designed to suppress, dominate, and erase. The enslaved man demonstrated that mastery of perception and patience is more potent than any weapon, more transformative than any act of brute force. And the lesson extended far beyond that dinner table. True authority is earned through insight, not inherited through oppression. The aftermath of recognition in that room was subtle, but profound. The guests, still seated, experienced a quiet psychological unraveling. Their confidence, their assumptions, their very understanding of social order had been shaken to the core. They realized, perhaps for the first time, that dominance is not a birthright, nor obedience an inevitability. Authority exists only where it is accepted, maintained only where compliance is internalized. And the enslaved man had shown, with terrifying precision, that compliance could be withdrawn silently, deliberately, and irreversibly. The master, once unyielding in his arrogance, now grappled with the fragility of the position he had always assumed to be unassailable. Every habitual action, every gesture of entitlement, every expected response from his guests and servants had been rendered meaningless by a man whose mind had escaped the confines of fear and submission. For the first time, he was confronted with the terrifying reality that control is never guaranteed. It is conditional, ephemeral, and fragile, an illusion maintained only by those who consent to its existence. The enslaved man's calm presence was the fulcrum of this revelation. He did not shout, he did not strike, he did not assert with physical force. His supremacy was psychological, precise, and absolute. He had internalized the system, studied it, mastered it, and now applied that mastery in a single act that laid bare the structures of power around him. And the room, caught between disbelief and understanding, had no choice but to acknowledge it. The guests' realization was the most powerful element of the evening. They had believed in permanence and inevitability, and now they saw that these were illusions. The system they revered was exposed as conditional, dependent entirely on perception and compliance. That awareness, the sudden, terrifying understanding that their assumptions were fragile, was a form of power the enslaved man wielded effortlessly. Their fear was not of the act itself, but of the truth it revealed, that domination exists only where it is recognized, and a single unbound mind can dismantle it entirely. And in that room, history was quietly rewritten, not with weapons, not with rebellion, but with the slow, deliberate application of awareness, patience, and strategic insight. The enslaved man had proven an eternal law of human systems. Any hierarchy can be undone when its foundations, belief, consent, and fear, are removed. As the night deepened, the psychological grip that authority had once held over the room loosened, revealing its fragility in stark relief. Every guest, trained to defy, to obey, to trust in the permanence of hierarchy, now confronted a chilling truth. They had been complicit in sustaining a system that could collapse from within. Their fear of rebellion had blinded them to the very mechanics that ensured their obedience. And now, that blindness had been stripped away. The master's confidence, once unshakable, had crumbled to near invisibility. Every carefully cultivated posture of dominance, the raised eyebrow, the imperious tone, the subtle control over conversation, was powerless against a man who had mastered the art of internal sovereignty. He realized, perhaps too late, that authority exists not as an inherent property but as a delicate contract between the one who commands and the one who obeys. Remove awareness, remove compliance, and the structure dissolves silently, invisibly, irreversibly. The enslaved man, calm and deliberate, had become the embodiment of a truth that few in history dare acknowledge, that the most profound power lies not in dominance over others, but in mastery over one's own mind. By refusing to internalize fear, by observing, calculating, and acting only when the moment aligned with years of careful patience, he had seized a form of control the system could never anticipate. The power he wielded was invisible, yet undeniable, an intelligence that had outlasted cruelty, patience that had outlived oppression, and awareness that had transcended generations of subjugation. The guests' reactions were subtle but telling. Their polite chatter had been replaced by silence, by glances exchanged in disbelief. The veneer of civility cracked under the weight of recognition. The structures they believed eternal were conditional, dependent entirely on the unchallenged acceptance of those beneath them. And that understanding, once internalized, is inescapable. They had witnessed something beyond violence, beyond defiance, a demonstration of strategic mental sovereignty capable of collapsing a centuries-old hierarchy with nothing more than clarity and timing. History often frames such moments as anomalies, as acts of rage or horror. But the reality is far more dangerous. It is not chaos that threatens systems of power. It is awareness. Awareness applied with patience, strategy, and precision can unravel empires silently, leaving no trace but the indelible recognition of fragility. And in that dining room in 1856, awareness had won. By this point in the evening, the room had become a laboratory of human consciousness, exposing the mechanics of power and the fragility of assumed authority. Every guest, every gesture, every glance was now filtered through the realization that the hierarchy they had taken for granted was nothing more than a fragile illusion. And the master, whose identity had been built entirely around dominance, faced the most terrifying of truths. Control is never inherent, never guaranteed, never permanent. It exists only where compliance and belief are maintained, and the enslaved man had withdrawn both silently, deliberately, and irrevocably. The act that had occurred, seemingly grotesque, seemingly shocking, was less about physical rebellion than it was about the absolute mastery of perception. The enslaved man had observed every weakness in the system, catalogued every habitual response, and exploited the invisible cracks in authority. He did not strike in anger. He struck with strategy. He did not act impulsively. He acted with foresight cultivated over years. And in this way, he demonstrated the deepest truth of all. The most dangerous power is internal, invisible, and entirely unacknowledged by those who assumed themselves untouchable. The guest realization came slowly but inevitably. Every polite gesture, every social assumption, every inherited entitlement now seemed absurd. They understood, in a visceral, almost painful way, that their social order was contingent upon perception and consent, that their obedience, or the obedience of those beneath them, was the only thing that gave their authority substance. And when that consent was quietly removed, the illusion of permanence dissolved in a single, silent act. The master's attempts to reclaim authority were pitiful. Every habitual motion, every command, every subtle display of superiority was now meaningless. The system he had built, the structure he had relied upon, had already been dismantled from within. His power had depended entirely on the unexamined acceptance of those around him, and that acceptance had been withdrawn with deliberate intent. This moment, quiet, psychological, and terrifying, is the forbidden lesson history refuses to teach. Systems collapse not from force alone, but from the refusal to participate. The enslaved man had not only demonstrated this principle, he had embodied it. And the truth he revealed is eternal. Mastery of self, clarity of mind, and strategic awareness can dismantle hierarchies that seem unshakable, leaving only the realization that power exists only where belief endures. By now, the subtle terror in the room had transformed into a palpable tension, as though the air itself carried the weight of an unspoken revelation. The guests, trained for generations to assume permanence in power, now confronted the fragility of the very structures they had trusted. Every gesture, every polite word, every ingrained belief about hierarchy had been quietly dismantled by a man whose authority derived not from title or wealth, but from absolute self-mastery. He had weaponized awareness, patience, and precision in a way that left the powerful unarmed and exposed. The master's internal collapse was evident, even as his outward composure faltered. His identity, carefully constructed around dominance and assumed invincibility, was now under siege. Authority, he realized, exists only in perception, maintained by the compliance of those it governs. When compliance is withdrawn, especially by someone long dismissed as powerless, the illusion shatters, and what remains is naked vulnerability. He had believed fear was permanent, that obedience could be enforced indefinitely. But the enslaved man had disproven both assumptions with terrifying clarity. The guests, too, were caught in the revelation. They had lived their lives reinforcing hierarchies, legitimizing authority through complicity and silence. Now, they were confronted with the uncomfortable truth that those hierarchies exist solely through perception and consent. Their sense of security, their inherited assumptions, and their belief in permanence were illusions. And those illusions, once stripped away, reveal the inherent fragility of every system built on oppression. The enslaved man's dominance was not physical, it was psychological. He had mastered the art of turning observation into leverage, patience into strategy, and clarity into inevitability. In doing so, he demonstrated a principle that terrifies every hierarchical structure: internal sovereignty. The mastery of one's mind and awareness cannot be legislated, policed, or suppressed. It is invincible, invisible, and ultimately unstoppable. History remembers the act itself with horror, emphasizing the grotesque spectacle rather than the underlying strategy. But the true lesson, the forbidden knowledge, is far more dangerous. Systems of power are only as strong as the belief and compliance that sustain them. Remove that belief, withdraw that consent, and even the most entrenched hierarchies crumble silently. And in that dining room in 1856, one man had achieved exactly that. As the night progressed, the gravity of the moment deepened, settling into the consciousness of every witness. The guests, previously assured of the dominance, now experienced the terror of realizing their entire world had been built on assumptions they had never questioned. The enslaved man had done more than shock them with an act of vengeance. He had revealed a principle that strikes at the very foundation of control. Power exists only where it is believed, and obedience only where it is unexamined. Awareness, patience, and deliberate action had become instruments capable of toppling a system the powerful assumed invincible. The master, caught in the unmasking of his own fragility, now confronted the terrifying truth that authority is not inherent. It is conditional. Every gesture he had believed enforced submission was meaningless once perception shifted. His wealth, his social standing, his entire identity as a dominant figure were revealed to be dependent on a fragile illusion, the unchallenged acceptance of those he oppressed. And that acceptance had been quietly withdrawn. He could feel it in the weight of the room, the subtle tension, the unspoken acknowledgement that his world no longer operated as he had assumed. The guests, too, were caught in the wake of revelation. Polite conversation and cultivated manners were powerless against the stark truth they were now forced to recognize. They had assumed permanence, assumed inevitability, assumed safety. And now, every assumption had been dismantled by someone they had long ignored, undervalued, and dismissed. That is the forbidden knowledge history rarely records. The most dangerous power resides in those who are invisible, underestimated, and internally sovereign. When they act with patience, precision, and clarity, entire hierarchies collapse without a single outward confrontation. The enslaved man's dominance was absolute, yet invisible. He did not shout, threaten, or display rage. His power came from mastery over himself, understanding of the system, and deliberate timing. That is why his act terrifies those who wield traditional forms of authority. It cannot be contained, predicted, or controlled. It exists outside of conventional measures of strength, and it exposes the fragility of every assumption that sustains hierarchy. And in that room, history was rewritten quietly, invisibly, but irreversibly. The lesson extended far beyond a single dinner, beyond a single plantation, beyond a single act. Systems fall when belief falters. Obedience is withdrawn, and awareness refuses to comply. And the enslaved man had become a living proof of that eternal truth. By this point, the room had transformed into a crucible of awareness, each guest forced to confront a reality they had never anticipated. The enslaved man had done more than expose the fragility of authority. He had revealed the hidden architecture of control itself. Systems of power, built over decades or centuries, are only as strong as the unexamined compliance of those within them. Remove that compliance, and the entire edifice trembles. Remove the belief that authority is permanent, and the hierarchy dissolves like sand slipping through fingers. And that is precisely what had occurred that night. The master, whose identity was fused entirely with dominance, now faced the profound terror of invisibility. Not literal invisibility, but the kind that comes when the foundations of everything you have relied on are suddenly shown to be hollow. Every gesture, every command, every carefully rehearsed display of superiority was meaningless. He could no longer rely on fear, on tradition, on expectation. He was exposed, stripped bare by awareness, and the realization alone was more devastating than any act of physical rebellion could have been. The guests, too, were caught in the same web. They had lived their lives in a world structured around obedience and hierarchy, and now that structure was revealed as conditional and fragile. Each polite gesture, each inherited assumption of entitlement, now seemed absurd and precarious. Their very perception of stability had been shattered, and while they may never have spoken the truth aloud, each could feel the shift in their understanding. Dominance is not given, it is earned, or recognized, and it can be quietly stripped away by someone who refuses to participate in the illusion. The enslaved man's quiet supremacy was a lesson in patience, observation, and strategy. He had internalized the patterns of oppression, studied them, and executed an act that redefined the rules of engagement without a single overt act of aggression. That is the most dangerous form of power, one history rarely acknowledges, the kind that exists in clarity, in awareness, in the refusal to be dominated mentally, emotionally, or strategically. And in that quiet, terrifying demonstration, the fundamental law was revealed. No hierarchy survives when belief falters, when obedience is withdrawn, and when one unbound mind refuses to obey. That law does not change. It applies to empires, institutions, families, and individuals alike. And on that night in 1856, it had been proven with terrifying, irreversible clarity. The final moments of that evening were less about spectacle and more about the quiet, suffocating realization of truth. The guests, once confident in their dominance and entitlement, now sat under a weight they could neither name nor escape. The enslaved man had not needed to strike fear through physical violence. He had wielded the far deadlier force of awareness and patience. He had revealed that every system of control, no matter how vast or entrenched, is entirely dependent on perception. Remove belief, withdraw consent, and the illusion collapses silently, irreversibly. The master, whose identity had always been intertwined with dominance, now faced the most profound vulnerability a human can experience: the recognition that his authority was never inherent. It had existed only in the minds of those who complied, who deferred, who consented without question. And now, that consent had been removed. Every gesture of command, every word of entitlement, every subtle display of superiority was rendered meaningless by a single mind that refused to obey. The terror he felt was psychological, existential, a collapse of the internal narrative that had sustained him for decades. The guests experienced a similar rupture, though filtered through disbelief and the desperate need to maintain composure. Polite conversation, manners, and inherited assumptions of permanence could no longer shield them from the stark realization their social order was conditional. Their understanding of hierarchy, dominance, and safety was based entirely on assumptions they had never questioned. And now, those assumptions had been stripped away with quiet precision. The enslaved man, in contrast, remained calm, almost serene. His power did not shout, it did not seek validation. It existed in the mastery of self, in the strategic application of knowledge, in the deliberate disruption of expectation. That is the kind of power that history fears because it cannot be controlled, policed, or predicted. It resides in awareness, patience, and the refusal to participate in the illusions that sustain dominance. In that room, an eternal law of human systems had been revealed. Hierarchy and authority exist only where belief endures. And when belief is withdrawn, the system collapses, not with noise or spectacle, but with quiet inevitability. That is the forbidden truth the powerful never teach, the knowledge most men never confront, and the realization that changes the perception of power forever. By the final hours of that night, the room had become a chamber of unspoken truths, an invisible courtroom in which every assumption about authority, obedience, and dominance was being judged and found wanting. The guests, still seated, were trapped between disbelief and the terrifying recognition that the world they had assumed permanent was nothing but a fragile construction. The enslaved man had dismantled it not with violence, not with spectacle, but with clarity, patience, and unyielding awareness. And that is what makes this story both horrifying and instructive. Systems collapse not because of brute force, but because someone refuses to participate in them. The master, whose identity had been meticulously built on dominance and control, faced the most existential of vulnerabilities. Every command, every gesture, every assertion of superiority now rang hollow. Authority, he realized too late, is not inherited, it is perceived, it is not absolute, it is conditional. And in that moment, the foundation of his life, the narrative that had justified his power, crumbled quietly before him. The realization was not physical, but psychological, a slow, creeping collapse that left him exposed, fragile, and painfully human. The guests, witnessing the unraveling, experienced their own subtle collapse. Politeness, tradition, and the illusions of entitlement no longer functioned as shields. They had always assumed permanence, assumed inevitability, assumed that the structure they supported was secure. And now, they understood its fragility. The lesson was not in the act itself, but in the revelation it produced. One human mind, unbound by fear and fully aware of the system, could dismantle an entire hierarchy without raising a hand. That is a truth history obscures, because it threatens every assumption about power, control, and dominance. The enslaved man's presence dominated without aggression, commanded without force, and revealed without explanation. Every moment, every glance, every deliberate pause reinforced the reality that internal sovereignty, mastery over one's own mind, is more powerful than any weapon, any title, any inherited authority. He had demonstrated the universal principle that no system can withstand clarity applied with patience and precision. And as the candles flickered and the shadows deepened, the eternal truth remained. Authority is fragile, obedience is conditional, and power exists only where belief endures. That is the forbidden knowledge that transforms the perception of control forever. And so, the night closed not with chaos, not with rebellion, but with an almost sacred, suffocating clarity. The dining room had become a theater of revelation, a silent chamber in which centuries of assumed authority had been dismantled in the quietest, most deliberate way imaginable. The enslaved man had proven something the powerful rarely teach and the obedient rarely question, that hierarchy is not eternal, that obedience is conditional, and that true power resides not in wealth, titles, or force, but in the mastery of self, in awareness, in patience, and in the refusal to participate in illusions. The master, stripped of the protective narrative he had long relied upon, faced a vulnerability he had never experienced. His identity, built entirely on the assumption of dominance, crumbled internally. Authority, he now realized, is a fragile construct, maintained only by the consent and fear of those it governs. Remove either element, and the structure collapses silently but completely. Every gesture he had considered enforcing, every habitual display of superiority, had no effect. His world, long considered immutable, had been rewritten in an instant by someone he had underestimated, someone he had believed powerless. The guests, too, were left in the aftermath of revelation. They understood, deep in their bones, that the order they relied upon for comfort and certainty was conditional. They had been complicit in sustaining it, unknowingly reinforcing the illusions of permanence and inevitability. And now, they were forced to confront the terrifying possibility that their compliance had been neither natural nor necessary, that obedience is a choice, and that the balance of power could be inverted by clarity, awareness, and calculated patience. The enslaved man, calm, deliberate, and unshakable, had transformed the dinner table into a crucible of forbidden knowledge. He wielded no sword, no gun, no army, only understanding, self-mastery, and the quiet strength of a mind that refused to submit. That is the kind of power that history fears, invisible, uncontainable, and irreversible. He had shown that one unbound human, fully aware of the structures around them, can dismantle centuries of oppression without a single outward act of aggression. And in that room, history had changed, not in the headlines, not in the chronicles, but in the minds of those who witnessed it. The ultimate truth had been revealed. Authority is fragile, hierarchy is conditional, and the moment someone refuses to participate in the illusion, even the most entrenched systems collapse. That is the forbidden knowledge few ever encounter, and fewer still survive psychologically. One man had rewritten the rules of perception, power, and obedience forever. This is the lesson that endures. Mastery of self eclipses mastery of others. Awareness destroys illusion, and the truth, once seen, cannot be unseen.